Well, good evening. I didn't expect to see so many people. Thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. And a special welcome to alumni who have found their way to Santa Fe for homecoming. My talk is going to be about what I take to be a deep disagreement between Thomas Aquinas and Dante. I want to call to your attention. Did you see the little picture there? I want to thank Veronica Tucker for that photo design. I wish I had thought of it. She's got Thomas looking into space, and Dante's looking at Aquinas. Kind of like Robert De Niro in some movie. And what you can see here is there's a kind of asymmetry between them. Thomas, as you may know, and Dante are about 2 generations apart. Thomas in the 13th century and Dante at the turn of the 14th century. So the quarrel here, I didn't really know what to call my lecture because it can't be a real argument since Thomas doesn't get to say anything back. So, but you can say something back in the question period. But they're not of the same generation. So it's really Dante looking at what I think is a very serious problem in the late Middle Ages. So the other thing is that the argument or the difference of opinion is not on the surface of the text, and it will take some focus because I'm going to read rather closely what's going on. It will take some focus on the text to take in what all is going on. If you like, you can consider it a badge of honor to kind of stay with me for this 45 and 50 minutes because it's a close argument. So I made this handout of quotations I hope most of you got. And that might help you see some of the textual evidence for the reading that I'm going to undertake. And maybe you'll be able to see what Dante is hiding, though much of the important stuff, I think, is in plain view, hidden in plain view. The big issue is the fate of philosophy in a Christian world. And I think it's the big issue that Dante wants to keep hidden, except for those people who want to think with him. And that means he demands more of them, of looking deeper into his text. So full disclosure, I believe a lot is at stake in this kind of reading between Thomas and Dante, because we're looking at a fundamental conflict in Western civilization. Sometimes it goes by the name of faith versus reason. And as you can imagine, it's a conflict that still is a big part of our political and intellectual life. I've tried to make Dante's thinking as clear as possible, but I admit, as we say nowadays, it's complicated. So let's dig in. In Canto 10 of Paradiso, Dante has Thomas Aquinas introduce the other 11 members of the Circle of the Sun, the teachers of theology. Thomas's role as master of ceremonies here is fitting in view of his vast knowledge of his predecessors, comparable perhaps only to that of Dante himself. So we have the great summarizer of Christian tradition and the great poet of the soul's journey. They are revered, and not only in the church, as the 2 treasures of Catholic learning. Yet there are a couple of surprising moments in Thomas's introduction of his fellow luminaries. at least as Dante stages it. For instance, Thomas is standing, or I should say floating, right next to Siger of Brabant, the professor of heterodox Aristotelianism and probably a heretic. Thomas censured Siger, this adversary, during his lifetime, and now he extols him as his saintly colleague. Even more striking is how Thomas singles out Solomon, the Hebrew sage and king. And so the first quotation on your sheet. The fifth light in the circle is the most beautiful among us. Within this light there dwells a lofty mind, Solomon. Its wisdom so profound, if truth be true, there never rose another of such vision. End quote. The reader might ignore such effusive praise. Thomas can't possibly mean that Solomon's wisdom surpassed that of Jesus Christ, but Thomas himself draws attention to his ambiguous remark. Later in our visit to this circle, he returns to it, ostensibly for Dante's benefit. And as we'll see, he spends much of Canto 13 explaining himself to dispel any impression he may have given that Solomon's wisdom was superior to the salvation taught in the gospel. Then he concludes his discourse with 18 lines extolling the art of making distinctions, the art he just deployed to uphold Christian truth, and another 13 lines chiding anyone who seeks truth without it. Now, most readers have been content to take this scholastic performance at face value. They are naturally overawed by Thomas's intellectual authority, just as Dante the Pilgrim appears to be. For in his encounter with the famous Dominican theologian, he says nothing. Instead, Thomas speaks as if he knows what is on Dante's mind. From the silence of Dante the Pilgrim, readers infer the assent of Dante the poet, and they don't distinguish between the two. But why shouldn't the poet speak between the lines of his poem as he narrates his imagined pilgrimage? We know that before the modern era, writers often employed strategies for saying things intended only for their most discerning readers. The confusing impression Thomas makes at the outset ought to raise our suspicion. The poet of the comedy has set the scene oddly if he merely intended to exhibit Thomas's dialectical skill. Why make the great defender of the faith assert incidentally what sounds like heresy? And not just any heresy, for the unqualified endorsement of Solomon's wisdom would do critical damage to Thomas's own theological system. His Summa declares Catholic doctrine to be wisdom absolute. I'm quoting, above all human wisdoms. And why, after Thomas has spent several pages defending his orthodoxy, why does he spend another 30-odd lines defending his analytical art, which no one had challenged? One cannot help but wonder whether he doth protest too much. Our proposal is that the Thomas episode in Paradiso is a parody and a riddle. It calls for close skeptical reading because Dante has a covert design. Thomas sets church dogma above philosophy and poetry, and Dante aims to subvert that rule. Dante deftly honors Solomon's freedom of intellect above the scholastic theology or theocracy that Thomas Aquinas represents. So my first section, it has 3 sections, and my first is called Thomas and Dante in Historical Context. Let me first say a few words about the importance of Thomas and where Dante stood in relation to his thought. In the High Middle Ages, as the works of Aristotle were recovered and commented on, the conflict between philosophy and belief in revelation had reached crisis level. The challenges of Aristotelian thought to religious convictions were increasingly felt. Heresy was on the rise. In 1277, the Bishop of Paris publicly condemned a list of 219 dangerous opinions. So the second thing on your handout is a couple of examples. Number 40, there is no more excellent state than to give oneself to philosophy. Number 154, the philosophers are the world's sole sages. So don't go around saying this stuff. In the decades prior to the condemnation, Thomas had worked out a solution to the conflict. He embraced natural reason in its own terms on the understanding that sacred doctrine was inviolable. His solution is often taken as the hallmark of good sense, balancing religious and secular interests. Its robust influence is indicated by several historical revivals. The two Summas, Theologica and Contra Gentiles, were the bulwark of the Counter-Reformation in the 16th century and the spearhead of the anti-modernist campaign of Pope Leo XIII in the late 19th century. In 1917, Thomas's teaching was adopted as the philosophy of the Church in the Code of Canon Law. This was followed by various neo-Thomist movements in the 20th century, engaging academic philosophers such as Elizabeth Anscombe and Alistair MacIntyre. These bookish crusades gradually invaded Dante's studies, so that many scholars and translators readily assumed that Thomas was Dante's master in the true faith. An exception is Etienne Gilson, the dean of Thomas studies in the last century, who noted divergence from Thomas's views on critical points. Most importantly, Thomas's effort to contain the excesses of philosophy was matched by Dante's campaign to delimit the authority of Rome. During the years that he was writing the comedy, Dante published the treatise On Monarchy, declaring the independence of the emperor from papal jurisdiction. The treatise would be condemned and put on the index of forbidden works. For Dante, the Church's attempt to suppress intellectual inquiry and political autonomy was a symptom of its decay. He deplored an institution that had lost the life of the spirit and meddled disastrously in worldly affairs. Thomas was the voice of theocracy in the sphere of Catholic doctrine. His magisterial reconciliation of faith with natural knowledge established their harmony on a clear principle, but one that ensured the Church's oversight. Secular sciences could be defined as specific fields of study with their own self-limiting goals. Theology, or sacred science, by contrast, addressed the soul's highest end, its eternal destiny as taught in the Scriptures. Faith proposed beliefs beyond the grasp of natural reason, often paradoxical ideas. Think of the Christian doctrines of the Trinity, the Incarnation, and creation of the world. Ideas like these cannot be proven or refuted, Thomas argued, so faith is free to embrace them without interference from secular science. Where Aristotle occasionally appeared to expound ideas contrary to the faith, like the eternity of the world, or where he downplayed ideas essential to the faith, like the immortality of the individual soul, Thomas observed that the philosopher gave no infallible demonstrations on these points. Revealed truth and the Church's dispensation remained unassailable. But what gives theology veto power over the possible explorations of natural reason? What justifies saying that Christian doctrine is actually higher, rather than simply other, than the operation of reason? Thomas asserts this superiority in the first question of the Summa Theologica. Article 5 asks, is sacred science nobler than the other sciences? He responds affirmatively. The nobility of a science is partly a function of its greater certitude, and the truths of the faith are more certain than the truths of natural intelligence. So then the next quotation, number 3, is from the Summa Theologica. Quote, Other sciences derive their certitude from the natural light of human reason, which can err, whereas sacred doctrine derives its certitude from divine knowledge, which cannot be misled. What is in itself the more certain, sacred doctrine, may seem to us less certain because of the weakness of our intelligence, which is dazzled by the clearest objects of nature, as the owl is dazzled by the light of the sun. Hence, the fact that some happen to doubt about the articles of faith is due to the uncertain nature of is not due to the uncertain nature of the truth, but to the weakness of the human intelligence. End quote. Weakness of the human intellect in grasping divine truth. This is the crux of his argument. But as far as hierarchy goes, doesn't it beg the question? Weakness in grasping what is said to be higher would seem to entail weakness in recognizing it as higher. In essence, Thomas is using the term certitude equivocally. The greater certitude he assigns to sacred doctrine cannot be the same certitude as professed by the other sciences, since the natural light and the supernatural light of the scriptures are essentially different. There is no independent scale on which to rank the self-persuasions of reason versus the precepts of revelation to which the will ascends. It is a mere proclamation of faith, and a bold one, to say that reason should be subject to it. Thomas is thinking that because philosophy does not reach incontrovertible conclusions about human destiny, sacred doctrine based on the Bible must be the superior study. Now, he can certainly assert that his beliefs are not unreasonable insofar as they are not contradicted by reason, but he cannot be sure that his beliefs are above the truth found by reason or philosophy. For his beliefs are merely those of one religion among others. Other religions can and do make similar unverifiable claims. Philosophy as a way of life and thought, even with its limitations, cannot be shown to be inferior to any particular creed. The late Father Ernest Fortin, one of the most judicious students of medieval Christian thought, found such a difficulty affecting the entire Summa Theologica. Thomas takes his faith to be not a bias in his thinking, but a confirmation of its truth. This includes the assumption that human beings are fully realized only in the world to come. How can he not devalue the life oriented toward happiness in this world? Any otherworldly an otherworldly viewpoint necessarily alters the original meaning of the virtues, humility and courage being two obvious cases. As for justice, Thomas teaches that inviolable precepts of natural law are inscribed in the hearts of all men. Learned inquiry into justice in the absolute sense, therefore, does not occasion a division between philosophers and non-philosophers, as it did in classical thought. The Christian scholar claims to know God as the ultimate source of justice and of every good. Therefore, all humanity should be receptive to his word revealed in the Catholic magisterium. The key distinction in Christendom is between believers and non-believers, not between philosophers and non-philosophers. Some medieval thinkers thought of religion as addressing the common people for the sake of their moral upbuilding. Hence, sacred teaching involved noble lies and exoteric writing. But the true religion, according to Thomas, could have no need of such methods. This brings us to the issue that decisively separates Dante from Thomas, that of truth in politics. Thomistic truth makes biblical history culminate in Catholic doctrine. For Thomas, the Bible is poetry uniquely written by God for all men's salvation. Otherwise, poetry is about pleasing representations and is, quote, the least of all the sciences. Dante must have bristled at such disparagement. The poets, he declares, do not share the perspective of the theologians. For the poets, the power of any significant text resides in its use of allegory and fables. Poets and prophets are no different in this respect. The wise conceal some truths in figures and stories as necessary for the education of humanity. Exotericism is a fact of political life. As imagination is central to human experience, inspired teachers use imaginal forms to mediate between sense and intellect. Their art has perennially united the various orders of societies and shaped entire civilizations. As the Hebrew prophets gave birth to Israel, as Homer schooled Greece, and Virgil elevated the mission of Rome, so Dante felt called to revive epic poetry and thus to forge a vital new Christendom. Remember how Dante's calling is portrayed in the limbo of his Inferno. There, the classical poets and philosophers enjoy a special grace and a mysterious illumination. A reader cannot help but be struck, in particular, by the scene where the 5 most august poets of antiquity proceed to admit Dante, the pilgrim, into their exclusive academy. This literary elite then share a secret which we are left to guess at. So now, citation number 4 is from Inferno. There I saw assembled the fair school of the Lord of loftiest song, it's probably Homer, soaring like an eagle above the rest. After they conversed a while, they turned to me with signs of greeting, and my master, that would be Virgil, my master smiled at this. And then they showed me greater honor still, for they made me one of their company, so that I became the 6th amidst such wisdom. Thus we went onward to the light, speaking of things that are here best left unsaid, just as there it was fitting to express them. Dante is one of these few chosen ones based on the renown of the epic we are reading, the epic which he had not fully written and in which he features himself. Is there a more audacious self-promotion in all of literature? This is not one of those post hoc prophecies retrofitted into the poem after the event. Rather, Dante is announcing how he has understood his world historical design from its inception. In plain sight, he conspires with the worthiest pre-Christian sages who have lighted the way for entire spans of cultural history. Now, it would be understandable to insist that Dante is writing the consummate Christian poem, notwithstanding his affinity for the classics. But by framing the comedy as a journey to the afterworld in the flesh, on the model of pagan heroes visiting the underworld, Dante calls into question Christian literalism about the afterlife. His lesson is ambiguous. What do Inferno, Purgatory, and Paradise mean, since these places are states of the soul that the poet experiences in this life? Here we should reckon with the kind of allegory that long interested Dante, the allegory of personal metamorphosis. Just before setting to work on the comedy, Dante had begun a series of poems on ethical self-transformation, followed by his own commentaries. That's an unusual technique, actually. That work is entitled Convivio, or The Banquet. It is his Eucharistic celebration, his gospel of life before death. At this metaphorical supper, Dante initiates his disciples into human happiness. Following Aristotle, he holds that nature arouses the individual's striving after virtue. For support, he sketches a cosmology of the noble. The noble, with a capital N, is the astral energy flowing down from the Empyrean, enlivening the world by degrees, according to the varying potentials of beings. Persons of high attainment encourage those below on the paths of virtue. Hence, the need for rhetoric. What Dante calls the beautiful lie is integral to the moral purposes of art. Now it becomes clear in the Convivio that he regards the gospel as an exoteric ethically edifying text of this sort. At the deepest level, it differs little from Aristotle or Cicero, who share the ennobling cosmology. Christ represents, quote, another incarnate God, into whom the deity descends to proclaim the way to beatitude. Dante's specific exegesis of the gospel at first may sound bizarre. Get this one. He decodes the scene with the three Marys at Christ's empty tomb as the three ancient schools of ethics in pursuit of the active good. The angel who sends the women away to Galilee is the voice of nobility, directing them to the life of contemplation. The very eccentricity of this reading of Dante's only testifies to his determination. He would turn the resurrection of Christ, the central dogma of Christianity, into a philosophical allegory. We shall return to the topic of resurrection later. The point is that for him, sacred texts are upbuilding poetry, a view totally at odds with the literal orientation of Thomas Aquinas. The good brother, Dante says tactfully in the Convivio, that's Thomas, was occupied with confounding heretics and non-believers, but he, Dante, aims at elevating people's thinking. As readers of Dante's comedy, we revel in its fantasy of spiritual travel. We feel the prophetic pneuma that sweeps through its pages. But we deceive ourselves if we take his usage of Christian symbolism to be orthodox and fail to observe how he reinterprets it, subverts it, in the service of a universal vision. Does Dante even need the dogmas of original sin and Christ's atonement? Granted, before embarking on his journey, he has lost his way, but his salvation is to recover the good of intellect, thanks to pagan Virgil, and to his beloved Beatrice, whom he has apotheosized as the divine wisdom. If the comedy is the great Christian epic, it is also a radioactive text that ceaselessly emits a philosophical energy into Christendom. Part 2, Thomas's self-defense. In light of these considerations, I propose a reading of the irony Dante intended by his portrayal of Thomas Aquinas in Paradiso. I say the irony he intended, but it could only have been intended for readers as daring in their thinking as a poet. Yet the irony is not bitter. There could be no doubt about his admiration for Thomas's monumental and learned output. Otherwise, he would not have made him the MC of the Circle of the Theologians. This was even before Thomas was officially canonized. But Dante's respect for Thomas's eminence did not preclude his having a cardinal quarrel with him. On Dante's view, Christian revelation did not supersede the greatest wisdom attained by the natural intellect, the attainment here represented by Solomon. Dante put that opinion in Thomas's mouth, however, making him declare that Solomon had no equal, and then have to revise the claim. In this way, the poet could suggest a heretical tribute to philosophy and simultaneously disavow it. The result is a subtle, parodic plot. Dante's Thomas has to try to align his initial praise of Solomon with dogmatic Christian theology. He is the defender of the faith, of course, while Dante plays his younger self as naive catechumen. Thomas will try to save the pilgrim Dante from the heretical opinion that Dante, the mature poet, actually holds. Yet here is the catch. Thomas's apologetic arguments fall short. Indeed, they are hard to take seriously. The challenge for Dante's bolder readers is to detect how Thomas's defense fails, so as to leave Solomon's renowned wisdom intact. Let us turn to the texts. In Canto 13, Thomas revisits his original praise of Solomon to clarify how it agrees with Catholic teaching. He will begin with his fundamental theorem, the emanation of divine energy and its direct reception by Adam and Christ. Then he will show that Solomon was not in their class, but received heavenly instruction merely as a king. So here's the first quotation from Thomas, Dante's version of Thomas, number 5. You believe that into the side from which the rib was drawn to form the lovely features of her whose palate costs the world so dear, and into his side, pierced by the spear which gave such satisfaction for sins both done or yet to be, as outweighs any fault found in the balance, all the light that is allowed to human nature was infused by the very power which made the one and made the other. And thus you marvel at what I said before, when I told you that the goodness contained in the fifth light never had an equal. That is, I'm going to translate that. Assuming Dante believes that Adam and Christ alone received the entire divine light, he naturally wants to know why Thomas said Solomon's light was without rival. Okay, so continuing Thomas, quote 6. Open your eyes to the answer I shall give, and you shall find your belief and my saying meet as truth as in the center of a circle. From the idea above the highest empyrean, light descends to the lowest elements, passing down from act to act, becoming such that it produces nothing more than brief contingencies. By these contingent things, I mean things generated, with seed or without, produced by the movements of the heavens. Their wax and that which molds it vary so that beneath the imprint of the divine idea, light shines in varying degrees. Okay, my translation. The creative idea radiates its light to all beings. But these are in various conditions to receive it, like wax, with different degrees of translucency and imperfection. Thomas continues, however, this is quote 7, however, if the clear vision of the primal power is moved by burning love and makes of that its seal, then all perfection is attained in it. In that way was the dust made ready to receive, and once, perfection in a living creature. That would be Adam. In that way was the virgin made to be with child. Thus do I agree with your opinion that human nature never was, nor shall it be, what it was in these two persons. Now, if I went no farther, how then was the other person, Solomon, without equal, would be the first words from your mouth. But to make quite clear what still remains obscure, think who he was and what it was that moved him to his request when he was bidden, ask. I did not speak so darkly that you cannot see. He was a king and asked for wisdom, that he might become a worthy king. He did not ask to know the number of movers here above, or if necesse with a contingent ever made a necesse, nor si est dare primum motum esse, nor if in a semicircle a triangle can be formed without its having one right angle. Therefore, if you reflect on this and what I said, kingly prudence is that purely vision on which the arrow of my purpose strikes. End quote. So the case of Solomon does not bear comparison with that of Adam or Christ, Thomas is saying. According to the Bible, Solomon asked God only for prudence, the wisdom to govern. He did not seek total theoretical knowledge. He did not ask how many celestial movers there are, what follows when a necessary cause is combined with a contingent one, whether a prime mover is necessary, or whether any triangle inscribed in a semicircle must be right-angled. In fact, Thomas continues, part of the confusion about the initial statement was verbal. So this is citation 8. And if you examine my use of the word rose, source, with open eyes, you will see that it referred alone to kings, of whom there are many, but the good ones rare. Take my words along with this distinction, and they can stand alongside your beliefs concerning the first father, Adam, and the one we love, Christ. End quote. When Thomas introduced Solomon, saying that no one else rose to equal him, he intended a comparison to the kings alone. That's what Thomas means. Neither Adam nor Christ rose, strictly speaking, but both issued directly from the Father. Thomas used the word rose, source in Italian, as a clue. Dante didn't get it. Surely he knew the Vulgate Bible's equivalent in Latin, surrectursit, in the Book of Kings. It says that no king shall rise to equal Solomon. That is confirmation of Solomon's natural origin and the limits of his wisdom. Therefore, Thomas's tribute to Solomon was never meant to impinge on the saving dogma concerning Adam and Christ. QED. Superficially, it looks like Thomas had everything under control all along. But has he shown that Adam and Christ surpassed the Hebrew sage in wisdom? He says that all perfection was in Adam and Christ, but he does not say by what common measure did their intellects exceed Solomon's. Or does he? He reduces Solomonic knowledge to kingly prudence on the grounds that Solomon's famous request to God did not include physics, geometry, and metaphysics. He implies that demonstrating propositions about celestial movers, causal principles, and the triangle in a circle is the common measure, the standard of human wisdom embodied in Christ and Adam. Thomas espoused the medieval notion, in fact, that the first human being was in direct communion with Godhead, so that he had total knowledge. Supposedly, we are to imagine Adam capable of rattling off the prime numbers of any magnitude like one of those child savants we occasionally read about. And Christ could do this too, if anyone had thought to ask him. But the very suggestion is farcical. That is Dante's point. He has Thomas make the prerequisites for wisdom sound like a master's exam in the Faculty of Arts. Imagine Solomon posing such specific scholastic problems to God, sprinkled with technical Latin. To put Solomon in his place, Thomas makes intellect merely academic. And incidentally, Dante states in the Convivio that both Christ and Solomon were perfect in la divina scienza, by which he means the most sublime wisdom. The sciences that Thomas invokes rank beneath it, and beneath ethics too. So in having Thomas challenge Solomon's professorial qualifications, the poet of the comedy is pulling our leg. To confirm this, we need only raise the obvious objection: what is Solomon doing in the circle of the sun rather than the sphere of the just rulers, if he does not exemplify perfected human understanding? Thomas is famous for wielding the sword that makes fine distinctions. But in Paradiso, it also proves useful for splitting hairs. The clincher to Thomas's argument was his claim that the word rose could only have applied to kings. Even on the surface, it sounds fussy. Indeed, back in Canto 11, he described St. Francis, who was certainly not a king, as a sun risen upon the world. He made a memorable pun on the name of Francis's birthplace, Assisi, linking it to the Italian ascesi, which means literally, I have risen. The poet's expose of Thomas has to be subtle so as to escape the notice of Orthodox believers. They should take on faith that Thomas has made the wisdom of Solomon jibe with Catholic dogma. As he put it to the pilgrim Dante, my saying and your belief meet as in the center of a circle. But even that reassurance can sound ironic to the wary reader, for it can also mean that Thomas's original statement, that Solomon's wisdom was unsurpassed, fits the poet's unspeakable heresy. It seems Dante and Thomas understand truth at different levels, and so address different sorts of followers. Listen to how Thomas sums up his lesson near the end of his discourse. This is citation 9. He who casts offshore to fish for truth without the necessary skill of distinguishing does not return the same as he sets out, but worse, and all in vain. That's Thomas, according to Dante. And his caution seems to echo the caution that Dante gave his readers in Canto 2. Now, this is Dante. He's speaking to the reader. Turn back if you would see your shores again. Do not set forth upon the deep, for losing sight of me, you would be lost. This is in Canto 2 of Paradiso. But the similarity only draws attention to the opposition. Thomas insists that without his skill, the search after truth must endanger one's faith. Dante turns the danger into temptation, inviting whoever has faith in him to keep their sights on him. The two represent differing stances toward the indefinite, which permeates language. Thomas will find ambiguities that reinforce one's basic beliefs, whereas Dante proliferates ambiguities that will encourage free speculation. For Thomas, free speculation looks like aimless wandering. He criticizes those who, he says, went to sea without a port in mind. For Dante, letting go of what is familiar and entering confidently into the unknown is not aimless. It is the way to fulfill one's true aim. Only through conscious risk can a human mind realize its natural powers of self-transcendence. We shall see something of how Dante experiences this ecstasy of intellect in the next section. So, this is the third and final part. The turn to Solomon. Dante's Thomas had to walk back his original commendation of Solomon back into the circle of orthodoxy in order to avert the threat of philosophy to the faith. But what about Solomon in his own right? For the historical Dante, as I mentioned, the historical Solomon was an exemplar of mature wisdom, a free thinker, a spirit-filled erotic poet, and a political mind that knew how to practice discretion. Dante's Convivio makes frequent reference to him, treating him as one of the sages, along with Aristotle and Cicero, and not merely as ruler of Israel. In fact, he doesn't mention it. Solomon's wisdom texts in the Bible clearly inspired the ethics of nobility in Dante's earlier book. Yet in Paradiso's Circle of the Sun, we have not heard from Solomon, though he is its fairest light and the subject of Thomas's scholastic display. Thomas has been speaking about him as if he weren't there, but he is there. In Canto 14, in the final scene of this circle, the poet lets Solomon speak for himself. Significantly, he speaks in Thomas's place. This is the scene. Beatrice tells Thomas to solve another difficulty. Her protege Dante needs to go to the root of another truth. How can the divine effulgence that souls experience here in paradise continue after the resurrection of the body without scorching their physical eyes? Implicitly, she is raising an Aristotelian challenge to Catholic teaching. Recall what you read when you were sophomores, what Aristotle taught in his treatise on the soul. You all remember that. When the intellect is active, it is not limited by corporeal conditions, so that it can think an indefinite range of objects. By contrast, a sense organ is a ratio adapted to a specific spectrum of stimuli. Extreme brightness is not just unpleasant, it destroys the balance of the eye. Beatrice is asking Thomas to explain how a corporeal eye will be able to endure celestial radiation that is the physical equivalent of what nearly overwhelms them now. Unexpectedly, Solomon steps in. Before I turn to Solomon's intervention, I should point out that the situation Dante created by letting him field the question. Casual readers are pleased to notice the obvious irony that Solomon, whose biblical writing expressed doubts about the afterlife, is now in paradise about to discourse on the resurrection. But such readers overlook the dramatic implication of his speaking up here in Thomas's place. By having Solomon arbitrate the dispute in Christian theology, Dante exposes Thomas's untenable position. Thomas just revised his tribute to the king by demoting his virtue to the political sphere. But the question about the light sensitivity of a resurrected body's eyes, does not appear to be a political question. If Solomon's answer is political, then it might not be the truth, simply. On the other hand, if his answer counts as theology, then Thomas was wrong to try to devalue Solomon's wisdom. So here is Solomon's reply to Beatrice's question. So this is a longish quote, number 11. Just as long as the festival of paradise shall last, that is how long our love will dress us in this radiance. Its brightness answers to our ardor, the ardor to our vision, and that is given in greater measure of grace than we deserve. When we put on again our flesh, glorified and holy, then our persons will be more pleasing for being all complete, so that the light, granted to us freely by the highest good, shall increase the light that makes us fit to see him. From the light, vision must increase, and love increase, what vision kindles, and radiance increase, which comes from love. But like a coal that shoots out flame, and in its glowing center still outshines it, so that it does not lose its appearance, just so this splendor that enfolds us now will be surpassed in brightness by the flesh that earth as yet still covers. Nor will such shrinking have the power to harm us, since our body shall be strengthened for all that can delight us. After that seraphic solo, whatever I say will sound rather deflationary. But I don't want to miss the implications of Solomon's comparison. First, a bland summary. In paradise, before the resurrection, the flame bodies are radiant, with brightness proportioned to their ardor, which answers in turn to their vision. At the resurrection, according to Solomon, when the souls are reclothed in the flesh, the depiction of the current, the direction of the current is reversed. God increases the light, which produces augmentations down the line, increased vision followed by greater love, and terminating in the super radiance of the flesh. The resurrected bodies at the end of the circuit will be more luminous than the garments of fire that the saints wear now. And God will supply them with the capacity to endure the otherwise blinding glare, along with the capacity to see him. Now for the implications. On Solomon's account, the bodies of revived flesh are flashier than the flame souls in paradise. But the flame souls are participating agents. Their love follows upon their own vision. Their brightness expresses it. They actually fulfill the conditions for human perfection, as stated by Thomas, a vision of primal power that engenders love. Their resurrection is superfluous. By contrast, when Solomon describes the resurrected bodies, he describes passive recipients. Their added radiance arises not in proportion to their own vision and love, but from light supplied one-sidedly by the supreme good. These new incandescent bodies, which burn brighter than their souls, thus reverse the order of the ethical. In their realm, the noble soul is outshone by the body. It is no longer virtue that enhances a person's being. And as for the physical light that is increased so that they may see God, this supposition has a devastating implication. The God beheld by these transhuman eyes must himself be a visible body. Incidentally, I take the liberty of calling them transhuman because Dante invented the word. He thought deeply about the possibilities of personal metamorphosis. We can take up the current relevance of his insights in the question period. So one has to ask, to whom does Solomon's image of an embodied immortality appeal? Not to the poet, at least not in the sense of letting bodies have dominion in eternity. Following Aristotle, Dante consistently scorns this common attachment. One might say, rather, that he incorporates incorporeality. Here in paradise, Just prior to Solomon's speech, he hints at the pity he feels for those unacquainted with the spiritual exaltation he knows. He tells us, as an aside, whoever here, this is quote 12, whoever here on earth laments that we must die to find our life above knows not the fresh relief found there in these eternal showers. For Dante, the divine outpouring of nobility and wisdom is always active. Well-developed souls do not have to die in order to enjoy it. They tune into a frequency that is always broadcasting. Now, Solomon is certainly tuned in. According to the Bible, he asked God for a listening heart when he prayed for wisdom to govern the people. Presently, in Dante's Paradise, he can hear the wish of the multitude of souls for a corporeal afterlife. When Beatrice requests an explanation of the resurrected body, the souls in paradise immediately raise their voices in wondrous song and whirl in a dance of anticipation. Solomon's description of the glorious new body fits the bill, for the double chorus then rejoices at hearing it. But note Dante's discreet dissent. He reports on the surprise he felt at this moment. This is quote 13. So quick and eager seemed to me both choirs to say their amen, that they clearly showed their desire for their dead bodies. Again, Dante appears indifferent to the desire of the multitude. The surprise is that this celestial multitude sounds like the earthly crowd whom he just pitied. They are as keen to have their physical identities restored as the earthbound are reluctant to give them up. This poses another question. At the start of this canto, Beatrice said that her disciple needed to hear how a resurrected body could endure the divine emanation in order to go to the root of another truth. Do not trovero andare al Paradiso. Given Dante's detachment from the chorus's zeal for incarnation, his alleged need must not be the same as theirs. What is his need? The need to go to the root that Beatrice wanted addressed. I submit that the root need of the novice to hear about the resurrected body is the need to recognize the underlying human longing, a need proper to a future poet legislator. Again, I take a clue from his earlier book, which honored Solomon and other virtuous sages upstream in the cascade of ennobling energy. What Dante seems to be learning as an initiate in Paradise is that the joys of contemplation, satisfying as they are to philosophers, cannot mean much to non-philosophers. He is learning something about the moral orientation of most people. Solomon's description of a bodily apotheosis in the afterworld may not dispel all doubts about its real possibility, but it does speak to the hope that ordinary souls have of reward for their unselfish virtues. Thus, Dante corrects his initial surprise, realizing how those souls' desire might fit with their goodness. They missed their dead bodies, he says, now this is the final citation, perhaps not for themselves alone, but for their mothers, for their fathers, and for others whom they loved before they all became eternal flames. Notice Dante's perhaps, a sotto voce speculation. He needs to find a motive for the chorus's desire for embodiment, as if that wish itself is the issue. His generosity, his nobility, posits the nobility of those who long for a beatitude that can be physically felt and shared. Dante, the pilgrim in paradise, is learning from Solomon that the teaching about the resurrection is a response to a human need. Charity toward humankind is the root of the teaching, the root that Beatrice alluded to. This teaching addresses a deep popular feeling. In short, Dante's poetic Christianity has a significant political dimension, taking politics in the broadest sense. he portrays himself as learning from Solomon about the nearly universal, sentimental appeal of the doctrine of resurrection. In Solomon's speech, wisdom and dogma are reconciled, not by ad hoc distinctions like Thomas would make, preserving dogma as literal and absolute, but by an edifying pedagogy that embraces the whole of humanity. For the philosophical reader, this is Solomon's wisdom in action, the wisdom about governing that would guide Dante in writing his epic poem. In this light, I think the central riddle of these cantos is solvable, the riddle of Thomas's double praise of Solomon. Is Solomon the wisest of the luminaries of heaven, as Thomas initially said, or merely the most prudent of kings, as he then wished to be understood to say? When Solomon is allowed to speak for himself, the critical reader might realize that Solomon exemplifies both at once. He is both the political and the theological sage. The root of the truth that Dante needed to see, the root brought to light by the fairest light in the circle of the sun, is a philanthropy hidden in the heart of the Christian message. Thank you for your attention.